From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is All Things with Kim Strassel, a Potomac Watch podcast.
Welcome to this week's edition of All Things with Kim Strassel. Donald Trump is issuing executive orders faster than a speeding bullet. And here this week to make sense of the scope, the substance, the legality of that approach is a man who has been there in the White House stir, who has seen how that sausage is made. Former Trump Chief of Staff Mick Mulvaney is here with us this week. And as a man who was also a member of Congress and then the head of the Office of Management and Budget under Trump, I can't think of anyone who would be better to give us some insight as to what we are seeing now. Mick, welcome to the show.
Hello, Kim Strassel. It is great to hear your voice again. Hope you're well.
Yes, you too. I'm going to jump in with a very big question up at the top. So Donald Trump has been back in office now for a little more than 2 weeks. It feels a little bit like 6 months. A lot is happening. Most of it so far shows of executive power, whether it be the huge tariffs we saw over the weekend levied on Canada or Mexico, from a spate of executive orders. Broadly, how would you describe what we are seeing in these first 2 weeks? Does this to you, as a former chief of staff, look organized and deliberate or chaotic? Is it impressive? Is it overreaching? What adjectives would you use?
With a couple of exceptions, there have been a couple of circumstances that I thought that things went off the rails. I think they probably mishandled that OMB memo regarding the freeze and then the withdrawal of it with the clarification. And I think they probably mishandled some of the January 6th pardons. I don't think anybody expected him to pardon the violent offenders. And I say that because the vice president had been on record saying he wasn't going to do that. With those minor exceptions, I think it's gone from their perspective fairly well. And you asked me to describe it. How would I describe it? This is pre-planned. This is what you're seeing now is the product of 4 years of getting ready for this, or at least 2.5 years of getting ready for this. Folks like Stephen Miller and Russ Vought working during the interregnum, since Trump left office in 2021, to get ready for this exact point in history to say, okay, let's do it all at one time. Let's flood the zone, to use an overused descriptive term. Yeah, so it's about what I expected. It's more executive orders, I think, in the first 2 weeks than he did in the first year last time. But it's a pent up sort of energy that is now seeing the light of day.
And in that regard, I guess, because it was pent up and been planned for years, it's very different from when you were there. Would you feel as though the whole vibe is a little different? What's the same and what's different?
It's entirely. Let me go the differences first. They know how to do it now. Keep in mind, when they got to office in 2017, when we got to office in 2017, because I was there starting, I think, February 15th, I'm not sure we knew how to do executive orders. I mean, these are people coming out of the Senate, out of the private sector, out of the RNC, and they didn't even know how to draw up a proper executive order. Didn't know that there was a staff secretary process. Didn't know that there were a team of lawyers at OMB that could help them do this. And so it was sort of learning on the job. That's entirely different now. They know exactly how to do this. They know how to pull the levers. They know what language it needs to get used. They know how to do it properly. That's one of the things that I see that is very, very different. The other thing that I see that is different is I was talking to Sean Spicer, a friend of mine. Sean was the first press secretary. And he reminded me correctly that I didn't meet him until I took the job in February of 2017. I'd never met Sean Spicer. Yes, correct. So there were people on the team who were working together who had never met each other. So you compare that to now where, there have been folks who've been working in the same office for the last 2.5 years to get ready for this. So it's an entirely different vibe. And what I mean by the vibe, not only do they know what they're doing, not only are they more comfortable with each other, they don't have to go through that who are you and where's the bathroom type of conversation at a new job. They're much more comfortable in asserting themselves. I just wrote a column for the New York Post. Sorry to put in a plug for a competing newspaper, but I think you guys have same ownership, don't you?
Yeah, we're good. Okay. We're good there.
And they asked me about I'm writing about CFPB, and back in 2018 or 17, I went across the street from the CFPB where I was the acting director and went to go meet with the White House counsel and said, look, I think I've got an idea on how to shut this place down. And the White House counsel looked at me and said, Mick, I'm up to my eyeballs in the Mueller investigation. I don't have time for this. I think today, If Scott Bessent, who just got named the acting director of the CFPB, walks across the street to the White House counsel and says, I got an idea of how to shut this place down, the lawyers are going to say, where do we sign up? There's an aggressiveness, an assertiveness, and a comfort level that says, look, we are going to do what we're going to do. We ran on this policy. We're going to run on this policy. We're going to deliver this policy. And I think that's a very different feel from where they were in 2017 when they're trying to, be the dog that caught the car.
Or when Bessent comes over and says, I have a plan, the lawyers say, we already have that plan. And
where
I
have you
think
been? That's right.
that gets to the question I want to ask you now. There's so much coming out. And just to touch on a few to remind listeners, I mean, the order dismantling DEI in the federal government, the back to work order for government employees, that grant freeze that you mentioned that's now being revoked, birthright citizenship, the tariffs, the firings, the pardons, the recent dismantling we're hearing of USAID. I think sometimes it's more useful to categorize these into different buckets. And one bucket that seems to really stand out to me, and I want to get your view on this, is that they came in this time when they understood they had to get stuff done, and they understood that part of that also meant doing something about this group of federal employees, this bureaucracy that last time stood athwart what a lot of you were trying to do. And so I wanted to just dive into some of those issues or those orders that have been aimed at the civil service. It's a big issue. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that at the end of 2020, it was something Trump was noodling a lot harder on, a civil service reform. I remember I wrote a column advocating that he full-throatedly embrace it as a campaign issue. He never really did that, but he seems to have spent a lot of time talking about it since. When you're looking at some of these, what do you think are the most far-reaching in terms of maybe changing the strength and the power the bureaucracy has to thwart an incoming president's agenda or to impose their own will?
Yeah, I love the idea of putting these executive orders into buckets, and I love the description of this as civil service reform. I wish I had come up with that in 2020 when I was pitching this to the president as I was leaving the White House. But civil service reform isn't sexy. He came up with DOGE, which is something entirely different. It's a different marketing camp. It's the same idea. I was begging him to fight back against the deep state in 2019 and 2020, but he's like, Mick, nobody cares about that. Well, now they care. So I was the last person responsible for reforming the federal government. That was my job as the OMB director. I was supposed to handle restructuring, and I failed miserably. Elon's a lot smarter than I am, and clearly already he's had huge PR successes where I had none. So he's made government restructuring sexy, and I love that. What do I think is the most important thing that he's done? I don't know if there's any one, Kim. I love the back to work directive. I really, really do. I love the fact that they're now going to do the research on stuff that we had anecdotal evidence about back in 2020, but didn't really know how to go about doing it, which is how many of these workers who were staying home had two jobs. I was always curious about that. I was always sort of cynical and said, I wonder, because we had, back in the day, you could still work at home like 2 days a week under the union agreements at the CFPB. And I kept wondering how many of these folks are running a side hustle. And, they're not really doing government work when they're home. They're doing another job. And I'm glad to see that that's going to be fully investigated. I like the fact, I think just in the last 24 hours, of course, you do lose track of the time when it comes to dealing with this Trump speed, that they gave, I think, notice to all the EPA workers who were hired within the last year that their positions were being
probationary.
Reviewed.
Yep.
Exactly. You're probationary for the first 12 months in many government positions. So the fact that they are going to go ahead and look at that, I think, is encouraging. It's all the stuff that I wanted to do and I wanted the president to do 4 years ago or 7 years ago now that he's looking at. So it's as a conservative, it's really exciting to see someone actually trying to change the way the government operates.
We're going to take a break. When we come back, more with Mick Mulvaney. Welcome back. I am Kim Strassel here with All Things, and I'm here with Mick Mulvaney, former Trump chief of staff. Well, and we've had the buyouts. We had this order on Schedule F, which really does kind of get in the weeds, but essentially my understanding allows the president to more easily move or fire a certain category of extremely senior civil servants that have significant policymaking authority, which makes them even more capable of thwarting something if they decide that they're going to exercise that will. Let me ask you this, and I think we'll get into it a little bit more because you mentioned it with regard to the freeze, but correct me if I'm wrong. I was talking to another veteran of the first term, and they were saying, and I didn't know this, that when you go about this too, the way that DOGE is doing it and the president, and you're talking about cutting whole departments or offering buyouts, it isn't actually necessarily impossible or hard to fire civil servants. You can fire people. It's more like getting rid of somebody because of specific actions they take or performance issues. That's when things get complicated. Does that sound right to you?
Yeah, I mean, if Congress came in and cut funding, then you could fire people. It's called a RIF, a reduction in force, because it's against the law to spend money that hasn't been appropriated. But if your question is it hard to fire a federal worker? Yeah, it's really, really hard to fire a federal worker. I remember we had a person at the CFPB who we caught taking kickbacks from one of the groups they oversaw. And the lawyers told me it would take at least 18 months to fire that person if I could fire them at all.
Wow, that's amazing.
Yeah,
That's
it
so
is. So
ridiculous.
it's one of my. I love the idea of the buyouts, but I got to put myself in the shoes of a federal worker who knows the rules. I'm like, okay, let's see. I could take this buyout and not come to work tomorrow, and they will give me 8 months worth of pay. That's plan A. Or plan B is I could not come to work tomorrow, and they could start the process to fire me for not showing up, and I can get paid for 18 months. I think I'm taking the 18-month buyout program. So I'd be curious to see how effective the offer is. Again, I love it from a messaging standpoint. I love it from just telling people what your priorities are. I'm not sure how effective it's going to be. I hope it is, but I'm also cynical after living in D.C. for 15 years.
Yes, your fellow veteran of the first term also pointed out, he said that for those who think that there will be mass people who quit or take these buyouts, they should remember that there's a reason a ton of people love working for the federal government is because the pay is good, the benefits are good. Okay, one last question though on this though, and the DOGE thing, because since we're on limits, I wonder what you think some of those limits will be, because I was really struck when Elon Musk came up with this, and he was very much focused on efficiency, right? And that's an Elon Musk thing. Like, let's get costs down to minimum. Like, let's make sure we don't have waste, fraud, duplication, etc. Then you had Vivek Ramaswamy in there with a much broader view of DOGE, which was let's take every regulation ever passed by a government and rerun it through Chevron and decide now whether or not it stands up, and get rid of like half of government rules. I mean, I think some of this is more realistic than other things. What do you think?
What DOGE wants to do is really, really, really hard. I think at the end of the day, when the books are written about DOGE and about Elon Musk's time in Washington, D.C., someone will figure out that it's easier to get to Mars than it is to do what they're talking about doing. There's no way they can save $1 trillion this year. Without Congress. You could do it, but you don't have the political will to do it. It's possible to do, but the executive branch can't do it by themselves. It's just not possible. I don't even think it's legally doable. So again, you're not going to find a bigger cheerleader than myself, but I'm also the one out there trying to temper expectations because they are not going to save $1 trillion. Look, he said he wanted to save $1 trillion this year. He took him 2 weeks by their numbers to save $1 billion. Okay. Using that math, unless they increase, and they could, but if you use a straight line sort of a mathematics on that, that's 2,000 weeks to save $1 trillion. That's 40 years. So these are huge numbers. You and I have talked about this before. One of my frustrations with Congress, when I was in Congress, when I was at the budget office, when I was in the White House, was that Congress votes on amounts of money that are just so large, no one understands how big they are.
Yeah,
It just is. And look, we still have, when I was there, Kim, and I know this is not the topic, but when I was there in 2017, I think we still hadn't spent 40% of the Superstorm Sandy money from 8 years before. We still hadn't spent all of the Katrina money from 2005. There's such huge sums of money floating around in the government that they just don't understand how hard it is to save that money. But anyway, that's a long story for another day. I wish them well. If they are 10% successful in what they want to accomplish, it'll be better than we had otherwise. I just think there's always people from Wall Street and Silicon Valley who walk in and say, oh, it's easy to fix government. All you have to do is run like a business. And those people tend to leave Washington with their tail behind their legs in short order.
You just perfectly raised another subject. I would argue that there's another bucket of Trump orders out there that are aimed at essentially changing or pulling back some of the Biden policies, and whether that be, for instance, DEI, but also some of the Biden spending. And obviously, we had this huge flap, and you referenced it at the beginning of the show, over this executive order to put a pause on grant dollars and loans going out. And there was a huge fuss, and then they rescinded it. Give us your take on what happened there and the legal questions of that.
I thought I knew what was happening until they withdrew the memo. So everything made sense to me up until that point. So let me tell you where I was, and then I sort of scratch our heads together as to what might have happened with the withdrawal. Impoundment is an issue that I've discussed at length with Russ Vought. Russ, who's he's the nominee for the Office of Management Budget Director, was my deputy. He's one of my close friends in Washington, D.C., and is extraordinarily talented guy, better on the budget than I am, and I don't say that lightly. And he and I talked about impoundment for years, about whether or not it was constitutional for Congress to do something like this. In 2017, we offered a budget that would have taken the employment levels at the State Department, for sake of discussion, from 75,000 to 65,000 people. And the Republicans in the Senate put a proviso in the spending bill that year that says, under no circumstances shall the State Department employ fewer than 75,000 people. We thought that was an overreach by Congress, and we thought that we had the right, using the impoundment authority, to run the State Department the way that we saw fit. Now, that goes against some interpretations of the Budget Control Impoundment Act of 1974, and I get that, but we were looking for ways to challenge the law. I thought that's what the memo was about. I thought the memo was the first chess move in, okay, we're gonna send out the memo. We're going to withhold all these grants. We're going to get sued. We're going to get sued everywhere in the country, in every single appellate district. We're going to have a couple of wins and a couple of losses. We'll have a split in the appellate circuits, and that's the fast track to the Supreme Court of the United States. And we will get to challenge the Impoundment Control Act of 1974 at the Supreme Court right away, and we think we've got a good case. That's what I thought was happening, and everything made sense until they withdrew the memo. Now,
couldn't agree with you more. That was entirely, I was like, and then why did you do that?
Yes. And there's only a couple reasons that Donald Trump changes course like that. Number one is if the market tanks. Now, the market didn't tank on that. We can talk about tariffs, what the market was threatening to do today when he changed his mind on Mexico or got a deal out of Mexico. But the other thing that he doesn't really like is bad press. Now, he's used to bad press from certain outlets. I mean, the Huffington Post is never going to write glowing pieces about Donald Trump, or the Atlantic, okay? But when Fox News and some of the other center-right and right-leaning outlets are saying, what the heck is this? What is Trump doing? He doesn't like that. So if I had to make an educated guess, I don't have any insight as to what actually happened, but that would be one thing that would explain Trump saying, well, just withdraw it. Just withdraw it. And that leads to, like we talked off at the beginning of the show, about things that might not have gone as smoothly as you wanted to. Someone goes out and says, well, we're withdrawing the memo, but not the policy. What the hell does that mean? That's a non-clarification clarification. So I don't know what happened. I thought I knew, but when they withdrew the memo, I had to wonder. Now, at the end of the day, it looks like the lawsuits are still going on anyway, so they may get their wish and still have the Supreme Court battle. So in the end, they may get exactly what they wanted to begin with.
Yeah, I believe from everything I hear that Russ Vought really does want that fight, and he feels really strongly that they have the better view in terms of the legality of impoundment from history. And if you read some of the papers, there's a very compelling case to be made as well, too. So I think it is a fight worth having, because it could be a really important one to changing the direction of spending in this country. We're going to take one more break. When we come back, more with All Things with Kim Strassel.
From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is All Things with Kim Strassel, a Potomac Watch podcast.
Welcome back. I am here with Mick Mulvaney, who in Donald Trump's first term served as his chief of staff. Well, you just raised it. Let me get to a kind of a final bucket. I mean, there are many, many buckets, but a final big bucket, and that would be what I would term Donald Trump's issuance of certain emergency actions or emergency declarations in the country, which he's then used to justify some other actions, including movements at the border, but also over this weekend, tariffs on Mexico and Canada. And, you are in a rare position to be someone that might actually be able to, as you just did, say, this is what Donald Trump likes or doesn't like, or this is what he's thinking. What's your view when you look at, these tariffs are blowing people's minds across the world. Obviously, already Mexico has stood up to the table and made some concessions, and Trump, as a result, paused them. But when you see these going out, are these really all threats designed to get certain agreements from foreign actors? Or is it what Donald Trump has suggested in this more recent campaign? Does he truly see it as some revenue generator for the long term for the country?
At the risk of overusing the analogy, there's a couple of different buckets for tariffs. There are tariffs for the sake of tariffs, to do what tariffs do, which is to protect domestic industries. So if he slaps a tariff on foreign steel, Chinese steel, for the purpose of protecting American production, those are real, and those are probably going to stick around. And there's another type of tariff where you sort of go in and say, you know what, I want to get somebody else to change their policy. I want Mexico to help us on immigration. I want Mexico to help us on drugs. And in order to get them to do what I want them to do, I'm going to threaten a tariff. And then there's the third case, which is simply just a tariff is one of any tools in a negotiation belt. The example might be a tariff on German automobiles. Trump doesn't really think that German automobiles are a problem. He's just looking for leverage in a discussion with Europe on other policies and so forth. So it depends on the type of tariff. Someone said the other day, actually it was Trump, who said, we could run the whole government on tariffs. And I ran the math, and you can't. I think the tariff rate, if you assume $3.8 trillion worth of imports every single year, I think that gives you a tariff rate of just over 150% in order to generate enough money to pay the government. And even then, you'd have to assume no substitution, which is never going to happen. The goal of tariffs is supposed to be that you don't import anything, right? I guess. So tariffs as a revenue source for the whole government is absurdity. Tariffs, however, Kim, if you take a look at it, if you put a 10% tariff across the board on $3.8 trillion of imports, that generates $380 billion. And that's not far off what the corporate tax generates. Okay, so if Trump goes into this discussion on the Tax Cut and Jobs Act of 2017, the extension, and he's looking for ways to pay for pieces and parts of that, and maybe he wants to cut the corporate tax further, maybe he wants to cut the corporate tax to zero if you manufacture in this country, maybe there's a way to pay for that portion of the bill with tariffs. I think that may be the table they're setting here for that discussion as we go into the springtime on the tax bill.
But Mick, all of that assumes that, you mentioned substitution. It also assumes no blowback. It assumes no wider fallout from everything. Wouldn't we agree that that's kind of an uber optimistic idea of tariffs, and that you could just replace the corporate tax because there won't be any economic consequences to slapping them on around the world?
Listen, I am a classically trained Western economist.
Yes.
What I will tell you is it's easy to make arguments when you begin a sentence by saying, well, all other things being equal. Ceteris paribus. Yes, it just sort of it's a great way to not have that discussion that you just mentioned.
Yeah, but unfortunately, the world is not that clean. And you know that firsthand from having been there. And we are sadly out of time, but I want to thank you for sharing your wisdom and your experience, and your taking all of that and trying to make some sense of what we've just seen over the last couple of weeks. So we want to thank you, Mick Mulvaney. We want to thank our listeners. We are here every week. If you like the show, please hit the subscribe button. And if you'd like to write to us, you can at pwpodcast@wsj.com.